Close your eyes and picture the Middle Ages. What comes to mind? Probably kings on thrones, armored knights riding into battle, and priests guiding the faithful. But what if I told you that behind, beside, and often right in front of those kings stood women whose power changed the course of history? For centuries, queens have been painted as silent figures in glittering gowns, waiting in the shadows while men made the decisions. The truth is far more fascinating. These women were not just consorts or caretakers of heirs. They were diplomats, warriors, and master strategists who could bend the fate of kingdoms with a single choice. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance. She traveled across Europe, ruled over vast lands, led rebellions, and raised a dynasty that shaped two nations. Or Isabella of Castile, who not only fought to unify Spain, but also backed the voyage that would reshape the entire globe. These are not minor footnotes in dusty chronicles. These are the bold architects of empires, whose influence still lingers in our laws, cultures, and even in the way we imagine leadership today. Yet their stories are rarely told in full. History, often written by men, pushed them into the margins, turning them into background characters when in fact they were at the center of the action. By stepping into their world, we get to see medieval power in a new light, one where queens are not exceptions but essential players. Welcome to our channel Words of Time, and in this video, we are opening the royal archives to uncover the forgotten queens who defied every expectation, mastered the art of power, and redefined what it meant to rule in the medieval world. Stay with us, because their stories will surprise you. The classic picture of medieval queens has long been painted in soft colors. They are remembered as figures who decorated the royal court, waiting in the shadows of men, carrying themselves with grace but rarely with authority. For generations, history books and popular culture have reinforced this impression. The queen was supposed to be a consort, a mother of heirs, a patron of the arts, and above all, a symbol of loyalty to her husband, the king. Yet this view is far from accurate. Behind the veil of ceremony, queens and other royal women were far more active than the stereotype suggests. They influenced politics, they acted as diplomats, they commanded loyalty, and sometimes they even led armies. Their stories show how power in the medieval world was not always held by the man with the crown, but often shared, shaped, or quietly contested by the woman beside him. To understand this better, one must remember that medieval Europe was built on a system that rarely gave women the legal right to rule. Kingship was tied to military leadership and dynastic legitimacy, both considered male spheres. In most kingdoms, succession laws favored men so strongly that even daughters of kings were often bypassed in favor of distant male relatives. A queen, unless she inherited a throne in her own right, usually had no official power. Yet queenship provided access to influence, and influence could be converted into authority in ways that official documents never fully captured. Queens became guardians of dynasties, arbiters in disputes, and mediators in conflicts. They shaped alliances through marriage and diplomacy. They held the keys to patronage networks that could stabilize a court or destabilize it entirely. They were central figures in the fabric of power, even though they rarely appeared in the chronicles as rulers. Consider the role of marriage. Royal marriages were never private matters of affection, though affection sometimes developed. They were contracts between dynasties, negotiated with as much calculation as any treaty. A queen carried her family's prestige into a foreign court. She often acted as a bridge between kingdoms, protecting her native interests while advancing her husband's cause. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married King Louis VII of France and later Henry II of England, she carried with her the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, one of the richest regions of Europe. Through her, borders shifted, alliances were sealed, and centuries of rivalry were set in motion. Her marriages changed the map of Europe, and her personal influence over her sons, including Richard the Lionheart and King John, shaped the destiny of England and France alike. Eleanor's case is dramatic, but it is not unique. Time and again, queens brought land, wealth, and legitimacy into their marriages, and in doing so, they ensured their central role in politics. Marriage also created another sphere of influence, motherhood. A queen was expected to produce heirs, but her role did not end at childbirth. She often became the first educator, shaping the values and loyalties of the next generation. Medieval kings, frequently occupied with war or governance, left much of the child-rearing to their wives. In this role, queens could pass down dynastic traditions, instill political lessons, and prepare their children for power. Queens who survived into their widowhood often became the protectors of their young sons' claims. They acted as regents during minorities, exercising direct control over kingdoms until their children came of age. In such moments, the queen's authority was undeniable. For example, Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, ruled as regent during his minority in the 13th century. She not only kept the crown secure, but also led armies against rebellious nobles. Her wisdom and determination allowed her son to inherit a stable throne, and her influence remained strong even after he became an adult king. If queenship was shaped by marriage and motherhood, it was also defined by the art of diplomacy. Many queens served as mediators between warring factions, not because they were neutral, but because they were uniquely placed to bridge divides. Their dual identity, foreign bride and domestic queen, gave them a perspective no male courtier could match. They could write letters to their families abroad, negotiate with ambassadors, and soften tensions between rival nobles. Sometimes their ability to plead mercy or forgiveness made them powerful symbols of reconciliation. Chroniclers often describe queens kneeling before kings to intercede for prisoners or rebels, a gesture that looked humble but in reality displayed considerable influence. A king who granted a queen's request did more than show kindness to his wife. He displayed clemency to his people through her, reinforcing his legitimacy while expanding her moral authority. Another aspect of queenship was the management of court life. The medieval court was not just a place of ceremony, it was the center of political life. Access to the king meant access to favors, lands, and offices. Queens often managed the inner circles of the court, controlling patronage and deciding who gained or lost influence. A queen's support could launch a career, while her disfavor could end one. Through networks of servants, ladies-in-waiting, and clerics, queens exercised a subtle but constant power that historians sometimes describe as soft politics. It was not the command of armies, but it could shape the balance of power within the kingdom. Some queens went beyond soft politics. In rare but striking cases, queens took on roles usually reserved for kings. They led armies, commanded fortresses, and directed campaigns. Matilda of England, also known as Empress Matilda, fought a civil war in the 12th century to claim the throne her father had promised her. Though she never secured lasting victory, her campaign reshaped English politics and paved the way for her son Henry II to become king. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II of England, went even further. She orchestrated an invasion of England, overthrew her husband, and ruled alongside her lover as regent for her young son Edward III. Her actions shocked contemporaries, but they also revealed the extent to which a determined queen could overturn the gendered order of her time. These examples remind us that medieval queens were not only passive consorts, but could also act as rulers in moments of crisis. Yet queenship was not only about individuals. It was part of a larger system of female power that stretched across Europe. Sisters, daughters, and widows of kings also played critical roles. Noble women who entered convents often became abbesses, wielding control over vast estates and spiritual authority over their communities. Princesses married into foreign dynasties carried with them cultural influence, spreading language, art, and ideas. Even women who never wore a crown could shape the course of kingdoms through their connections. The web of dynastic marriage meant that a single woman might be tied to several courts at once, allowing her to act as a channel of information and influence. When seen in this light, the medieval world was less a story of male kings and more a network of families in which women played indispensable roles. It is also important to remember how queenship was represented. Chronicles, often written by male clerics, did not always praise powerful queens. Instead, they sometimes portrayed them as dangerous or unnatural when they stepped beyond traditional roles. Women who wielded authority were accused of ambition, cruelty, or even witchcraft. Isabella of France, for example, was nicknamed the She-Wolf of France for her role in deposing her husband. Such labels reveal how threatening female power appeared to some contemporaries. Yet they also prove how visible that power could be. The very fact that chroniclers denounced these women shows that they could not be ignored. Behind every accusation of excess lies a recognition of influence. Religion played an equally central role in shaping the lives of queens. Medieval queens were expected to embody piety, not only as private individuals, but also as public figures. They often served as patrons of churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions. By sponsoring religious projects, queens reinforced their legitimacy and created lasting legacies. Some were remembered for their holiness as much as for their politics. Elizabeth of Hungary, though not a ruling queen, became famous for her charity and later canonized as a saint. Such figures blurred the lines between political authority and spiritual authority. Queens who cultivated an image of piety gained moral capital that could be wielded in politics as effectively as armies or treaties. The study of medieval queens also reminds us that power is not always measured by formal titles. Influence can be invisible, operating through persuasion, mediation, and relationships rather than official decrees. The myth of the silent queen erases this truth, but the historical record, when read carefully, reveals it. Letters, charters, and chronicles show queens acting as advisors, protectors, and decision-makers. They appear in moments of crisis, but also in the daily work of governance. They were not only wives and mothers, they were strategists, diplomats, and sometimes warriors. To reduce them to passive ornaments is to misunderstand the nature of medieval politics itself. Opening the royal archives, in both a literal and figurative sense, forces us to rethink the history of power. The medieval world was not simply ruled by kings while queens stood by their side. It was a complex system where women, despite legal limits, found ways to shape events. They used the tools available to them, marriage, motherhood, patronage, diplomacy, and even open rebellion, to influence kingdoms. Their stories remind us that power is rarely absolute and rarely confined to one gender. The myth of the powerless queen collapses under the weight of evidence. What remains is a richer, more complex picture of medieval society, one where women did not merely survive, but thrived and reshaped the very definition of rule. The deeper we look, the more examples we find. Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England, played a decisive role in the Wars of the Roses. As her husband slipped into bouts of mental illness, she became the driving force behind the Lancastrian cause. She raised armies, directed campaigns, and fought tirelessly to defend her son's claim to the throne. Though ultimately defeated, her leadership left a permanent mark on English history. Similarly, Joanna I of Naples ruled in her own right during the 14th century, navigating a turbulent reign filled with wars, conspiracies, and accusations. She demonstrated that even in a world hostile to female rule, it was possible to exercise sovereignty with determination and skill. The stories of these women also show the price of power. Queens who stepped too far into the realm of kings often faced backlash. Their reputations were tarnished, their characters maligned, and their legacies contested. Yet the very intensity of the criticism proves their importance. A silent, powerless queen would not have provoked such reactions. It was precisely because these women mattered that they were attacked. Over time, the myths of dangerous, ambitious queens served to reinforce patriarchal norms. But today, revisiting their lives allows us to challenge those myths and see the reality beneath them. If we think of medieval power as a stage, the king may have been the central figure, but the queen was never absent. She moved across the stage, sometimes in the background, sometimes at the forefront, but always part of the drama. Her role was flexible, adapting to circumstance, opportunity, and personality. Some queens embraced tradition, others defied it, but all operated within a system that depended on them more than it admitted. The survival of dynasties often rested on their shoulders. The stability of kingdoms often relied on their mediation. The spread of culture, religion, and diplomacy often traveled through them. Without queens, the story of medieval Europe would be incomplete. In examining the lives of medieval queens, we also gain insight into the nature of history itself. For centuries, their contributions were overlooked or minimized, not because they were unimportant, but because they did not fit neatly into the categories valued by traditional historians: battles, laws, and male rulers. To recover their stories requires looking beyond official records, piecing together fragments, and rethinking what counts as political action. It challenges us to broaden our understanding of power, to see it not only in crowns and armies, but also in influence, persuasion, and resilience. The myth of the silent medieval queen is one of the most enduring illusions of history. Yet when we open the royal archives and examine the evidence, we find a different reality. We find women who used marriage as a weapon, who shaped dynasties through motherhood, who negotiated peace and declared war, who built cultural and religious legacies, and who sometimes seized crowns for themselves. They were not shadows behind kings, but essential actors in the story of Europe. Their lives show us that even in a world that sought to silence them, they found ways to speak, to act, and to rule. Far from being passive, they were strategists, warriors, and diplomats who redefined what power meant in the medieval age. And so, the image of medieval queens must be redrawn. They were not simply ladies-in-waiting, nor were they silent figures behind the throne. They were dynamic, influential, and sometimes radical forces in a world that pretended to deny them power. Their legacy is not just a footnote to the history of kings, but a story of resilience, ambition, and authority that continues to resonate today. By recognizing them for who they truly were, we not only correct the record, but also expand our understanding of the past. The medieval queen, once seen as a decorative figure, emerges instead as a central architect of power, reminding us that history is always more complex than the myths it leaves behind. Before we look closely at the lives of some of the most remarkable queens who helped shape entire regions, it is important to remember how radical their very existence was. A queen who ruled not as a consort, but as a sovereign was a rare and often contested figure. Even queens who did not hold crowns directly but wielded enormous influence behind them were constantly tested, scrutinized, and criticized. Yet in spite of these limitations, there were women who not only managed to secure positions of authority, but who also transformed kingdoms, altered the course of dynasties, and left behind legacies as powerful as those of any king. These women were not merely keeping the throne warm until the next male heir could take it. They were actively reshaping the political, cultural, and military landscapes of their worlds. To appreciate the scale of what they achieved, we must first introduce them as people, not only as monarchs or historical figures. They were often born into dynasties that expected them to serve as bargaining chips in marriage alliances, daughters sent abroad to cement treaties. Yet once in their new courts, many queens turned what looked like weakness into strength. Their very status as outsiders often gave them unusual leverage. They had loyalties to two families and two lands, and this dual identity could be turned into a powerful diplomatic tool. Some of them leaned into piety and patronage, building reputations as moral figures whose advice could not easily be dismissed. Others wielded their wealth with shrewd precision, financing armies or paying for fortifications when kings could not. And some, perhaps the most daring of all, stepped directly into military leadership, leading campaigns, commanding fortresses, and riding at the head of armies. They took on roles that were supposed to belong to men, and in doing so, they broke every expectation of their age. Eleanor of Aquitaine is often remembered as the quintessential example of such a queen, and for good reason. Born into one of the wealthiest and most powerful duchies in Europe, she inherited Aquitaine in her own right, a fact that immediately made her one of the most sought-after heiresses of her generation. Her marriage to Louis VII of France initially seemed like the perfect union, the pious young king and the cultured, ambitious duchess. Yet Eleanor was no passive figure content to follow her husband. She joined him on the Second Crusade, traveling across continents at a time when most queens remained at home. Chroniclers, uncomfortable with her visible presence and assertive role, often criticized her, but their disapproval only highlights how extraordinary her behavior was. When her marriage to Louis collapsed, she did something few women in her position could imagine. She secured an annulment and within months married Henry of Anjou, who soon became Henry II of England. Through this second marriage, Eleanor became Queen of England, but more importantly, she joined two of the largest and wealthiest territories in Europe under one dynasty. The lands of the Angevin Empire stretched from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees. Eleanor's Aquitaine was not simply an addition to this empire. It was its jewel, the source of much of its wealth and culture. Eleanor proved not only to be a duchess and queen, but also a political operator who could influence both the French and English courts. When Henry and their sons clashed in bloody rebellions, Eleanor sided with her children, showing that her loyalty to her duchy and her role as mother could outweigh even the bonds of marriage to a king. She was imprisoned for years as a result, but once Henry died, Eleanor returned to power as regent for her son Richard the Lionheart. She managed the kingdom in his absence while he fought abroad and later secured his ransom when he was captured. Even in her later years, she remained active, arranging marriages for her grandchildren and securing the future of her dynasty. To view her only as the wife of two kings would be to miss the far larger truth. She was the architect of one of the most influential dynasties in medieval Europe, a patron of literature and law, and a woman whose decisions reverberated for generations. Eleanor's story shows how queenship could operate across borders, binding together vast realms and shaping the very idea of kingship itself. But not every queen's power came from marriage alone. In the Iberian Peninsula, Urraca of Leon became one of the most surprising figures of her time because she did something few women were ever allowed to do. She ruled in her own right as queen regnant. Born the daughter of King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, Urraca inherited the throne after her father's death. Her right to rule was not undisputed. Many nobles and clerics argued that a woman could not be sovereign, and her reign was marked by rebellion, war, and constant negotiation. Yet despite the chaos, Urraca proved to be not only resilient, but also a gifted strategist. Her marriage to Alfonso of Aragon was intended to strengthen her position, but it quickly turned into open conflict. Instead of being reduced to a pawn in her husband's political ambitions, Urraca fought back. She refused to be overshadowed, and the kingdom split between those who supported her and those who supported her husband. It would have been easy for a woman in her situation to be overthrown or forced into retreat, yet Urraca endured. She commanded her own forces, defended her lands, and continued to assert her right to sovereignty. The chronicles, often hostile, describe her as quarrelsome and manipulative, but beneath their criticism lies the recognition of her unusual strength. She refused to relinquish her crown, and through her persistence, she kept the kingdom of Leon alive at a time when it could have been absorbed into Aragon or Castile. Her reign was messy and filled with conflict, but it demonstrated beyond doubt that a woman could hold power not only as a consort, but as the rightful ruler of a realm. Eleanor and Urraca reveal two distinct paths to queenship. Eleanor used her marriages, her role as mother, and her long life to weave together dynasties, influence kings, and shape empires. Urraca stood alone as a sovereign, battling to maintain her authority against men who sought to take it from her. Both challenged the norms of their societies. Both showed that queens were not destined to be silent, and both left legacies that stretched far beyond their lifetimes. These are only two examples, but they remind us of the breadth of female power in the medieval period, and they invite us to look deeper into the stories of other queens who likewise built empires with their actions. The importance of these women lies not only in their victories, but in the ways they redefined power itself. By financing wars, forging alliances, and commanding loyalty, they showed that authority was not limited to the man who wore the crown. They also revealed how fragile male power could be when confronted with a determined queen. Kings were often absent, tied up in wars abroad, crusades, or disputes with their nobles. Queens stepped into these absences, filling gaps in governance, ensuring stability, and at times taking command themselves. Far from being marginal figures, they became the glue that held empires together. When we look at medieval history through their eyes, we see less of a rigid hierarchy of kings over queens and more of a constant negotiation where women played indispensable roles. In reflecting on the lives of Eleanor and Urraca, we also see how their reputations have been shaped by those who wrote their histories. Chroniclers, almost always men, struggled to reconcile female authority with their expectations of how society should work. Eleanor was described as willful, even scandalous, for her independence, while Urraca was vilified for her quarrels. Yet such descriptions are themselves evidence of their power. Had they been irrelevant, they would not have drawn such intense judgment. Their very visibility shows us that they mattered profoundly. To recover their true stories, we must read against the grain, recognizing that the criticisms of contemporaries often conceal the traces of influence and success. The stories of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Urraca of Leon are windows into a larger truth. Queens did not merely exist in the shadow of kings. They stood at the heart of medieval politics, culture, and war. They used every tool at their disposal, marriage, motherhood, wealth, piety, diplomacy, and sometimes arms, to carve out spaces of authority. Their achievements were not accidents or exceptions. They were part of a long tradition of women who, against all odds, built empires and ensured that their names, though sometimes distorted, would echo through the centuries. The image of the queen as a silent consort dissolves even further when we look closely at the ways these women navigated the political labyrinth of their age. Power in the medieval world was never just about swords, castles, or battlefields. Warfare could decide succession, but what held kingdoms together or tore them apart was politics. The shifting alliances at court, the bitter disputes over inheritance, the constant need to manage nobles, clergy, and foreign rulers. In this world of endless negotiation, queens developed extraordinary skill. They learned how to read personalities, how to sense opportunity in crisis, and how to balance competing interests so that the fragile structure of their realms did not collapse. What looks to us like survival often amounted to mastery. One of the clearest windows into this mastery comes through the figure of the regent queen. Medieval Europe was filled with moments when kings died young, leaving behind children too small to rule. Succession laws dictated that the crown passed immediately to the heir, no matter his age, but a child could not sit in council, lead armies, or impose justice. Someone had to govern in his name, and more often than not, that someone was his mother. These regencies could last for years, even decades, and in that time the queen effectively became sovereign. The arrangement was temporary by design, yet its impact was immense. Queens in these positions balanced two urgent tasks: to safeguard the throne for their child and to ensure the stability of the realm until he came of age. In doing so, they often acted with an authority indistinguishable from that of a king. Blanche of Castile, the mother of Louis IX of France, offers a striking example. When her husband, King Louis VIII, died suddenly, she found herself regent for her 12-year-old son. Nobles across the kingdom saw an opportunity to press their claims and resist the crown. England, always eager to weaken its rival, supported these rebels. Blanche responded with decisiveness. She raised armies, secured key castles, and personally negotiated with barons. Chroniclers record her moving among the soldiers, encouraging them with words that carried the weight of both queen and mother. Under her guidance, the rebellion collapsed, and her son inherited a throne not weakened but strengthened. Even after Louis reached adulthood, Blanche remained his close advisor, a partner in governance whose counsel he valued above all. Her regency demonstrates how a queen could embody stability, wielding authority not only because she was the mother of the king, but because she proved herself as a ruler in her own right. Catherine de' Medici in France centuries later faced a similar, but even more treacherous challenge. Widowed at a young age, she became regent for her son Charles IX during one of the most violent periods of French history, the Wars of Religion. France was divided between Catholics and Protestants, and civil war loomed on every horizon. Catherine, foreign by birth and often mistrusted by both factions, nevertheless steered the monarchy through years of crisis. She attempted to balance the factions through negotiation, marriage alliances, and shifting policies. While her reputation has often been darkened by the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, her larger achievement was to keep the Valois monarchy alive during decades when it could easily have collapsed. Her regency shows the complexity of female rule. She was simultaneously praised for her prudence and condemned for her cunning, but her survival in such a hostile environment proves her mastery of the political maze. These regencies show us one strategy queens used to hold absolute sway in periods of vulnerability. Their authority was not always secure, but they turned the very circumstances of their motherhood into a political weapon. In a society that revered dynastic continuity, the mother of the young king carried unique legitimacy. She could command loyalty not only as ruler, but as guardian of the future. That combination of roles gave regent queens a kind of double authority, both personal and dynastic, that few others could rival. Yet not all queens held crowns directly or served as regents. Many exercised subtler forms of influence that proved just as enduring. Patronage, diplomacy, and marriage were among the most potent instruments of power available to them, and when wielded with skill, they could shape entire geopolitical landscapes. Patronage was a cornerstone of medieval politics. Kings rewarded loyalty with land, offices, and favors, and queens, though often overlooked, distributed patronage of their own. A word from the queen could secure a position at court, a grant of land, or entry into royal service. This made her a magnet for petitioners and created networks of obligation that expanded her influence. Through her ladies-in-waiting, clerks, and household officers, the queen could bind nobles to her cause, ensuring that her voice carried weight in council. Patronage also extended into the cultural and religious spheres. By sponsoring monasteries, churches, and artists, queens cultivated moral authority and crafted images of themselves as pious protectors of the realm. Such images were not mere decoration. They reinforced political legitimacy and provided leverage in disputes. Diplomacy was another arena where queens excelled. Their position as bridges between dynasties made them natural intermediaries. A queen born in one kingdom but married into another could maintain correspondence with her relatives, serving as an informal channel of communication when official negotiations stalled. Queens frequently acted as peacemakers, interceding in conflicts between their husbands and foreign rulers. They also used marriage alliances of their children as weapons of policy. By arranging marriages that linked their families to powerful neighbors, queens helped to secure borders, prevent wars, or create new opportunities for expansion. In this way, personal connections became instruments of statecraft. Isabella of Castile illustrates how far such strategies could go. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon was itself a diplomatic masterstroke, uniting two major kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula. Together they launched the Reconquista's final campaigns, but Isabella's role was far more than supportive. She was deeply involved in planning and financing wars, drawing on her control over Castilian resources. She negotiated directly with nobles, ensuring their cooperation, and used her piety to rally support from the church. She also oversaw the marriage diplomacy of her children, forging ties with Portugal, England, and the Habsburgs. Each marriage extended the reach of her dynasty, ensuring that Castile and Aragon were at the heart of European politics for generations. Through these strategies, Isabella turned the tools of patronage, diplomacy, and marriage into engines of empire building. The subtlety of this power is worth emphasizing. To modern eyes, it may seem less dramatic than battles or coronations, but in the medieval context it was just as decisive. Wars were costly and uncertain. Politics was constant and unavoidable. A well-placed marriage could prevent a war before it started. A queen's patronage could hold nobles loyal when rebellion threatened. A carefully cultivated image of piety could disarm critics and provide legitimacy to policies that might otherwise have faced resistance. These were not secondary acts of influence, but core strategies of governance. Even within religious constraints, queens found ways to assert authority. The church often preached that women should be submissive, yet queens turned piety to their advantage. By presenting themselves as devout mothers, protectors of the poor, or patrons of monasteries, they cloaked their power in virtue. This allowed them to act forcefully without appearing to transgress gender norms. Some queens even used their religious standing to challenge clerics or intervene in disputes between bishops and nobles. Far from silencing them, religious dogma provided a framework within which they could maneuver. What emerges from these stories is a portrait of queens as masters of adaptation. They did not command power in the same ways kings did, but they exploited every avenue available to them. When war threatened, they could lead armies or finance campaigns. When dynasties wavered, they could act as regents, holding the throne until stability returned. When politics demanded subtlety, they turned to patronage, diplomacy, and marriage. Each strategy required not only intelligence but courage, for failure could mean not just loss of influence, but loss of life. Queens who succeeded did so because they understood the labyrinth they lived in and learned to navigate it better than many of their male counterparts. Seen this way, the myth of the silent medieval queen falls apart entirely. These women were not merely surviving in a man's world. They were mastering it, bending its rules to their advantage, and in the process leaving legacies that outlasted the kingdoms they served. The crowns may have been worn by kings, but the fabric of political life was often stitched by queens, weaving together threads of regency, patronage, diplomacy, and faith into the intricate tapestry of medieval power. The stories of queens who navigated the treacherous landscape of medieval politics do not end with their immediate victories or defeats. Their legacies reach far beyond the walls of their castles and the councils of their courts. For too long, they have been remembered as remarkable women rather than remarkable leaders, as if their contributions could only be understood through the lens of gender. Yet when we look closely at their actions and their impact, it becomes clear that they were not simply women in power, but leaders of the highest order, measured by the same standards we apply to kings, generals, and statesmen. They did not merely occupy space in a man's world. They reshaped that world in ways that still echo today. One of the myths that lingers stubbornly is the idea that queenship was an exception, that the women who rose to prominence did so against overwhelming odds and therefore should be admired primarily for their courage in defying convention. While it is true that their paths were often more difficult than those of their male counterparts, framing them solely in this way diminishes their actual accomplishments. These queens were not only anomalies but also innovators, decision-makers, and builders of institutions. They left behind laws, cultural reforms, and educational foundations that shaped their societies. In this sense, their significance is not confined to the fact that they were women, It lies in the fact that they were extraordinary leaders whose decisions helped define the course of nations. Consider again Isabella of Castile. Her achievements are often remembered through the lens of conquest, particularly the completion of the Reconquista and the sponsorship of Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. But her influence was far broader. Isabella enacted reforms that transformed the governance of Castile. She standardized legal codes, strengthened royal authority against overmighty nobles, and worked to create a more efficient tax system. She emphasized education, not only for her own children but for her court, surrounding herself with scholars and advisors who helped shape a more literate and intellectually engaged monarchy. These reforms were not side projects, but central to her vision of rule, and they endured long after her death. In this sense, Isabella was not simply a warrior queen or a patron of exploration. She was a reformer whose legacy extended into the very structure of Spanish governance. Eleanor of Aquitaine, too, left behind more than dynastic alliances and rebellious sons. She was a patron of culture whose courts in Aquitaine and later in England became centers of art, poetry, and law. Under her influence, the ideas of courtly love and chivalric conduct flourished, shaping the values of European aristocracy for centuries. Her support of troubadours and poets may seem less concrete than battles or laws, yet culture is itself a form of power, one that defines how societies imagine themselves. By fostering a culture that celebrated refinement, honor, and loyalty, Eleanor helped set the stage for a medieval nobility that saw itself as bound not only by power but also by ideals. Her vision of leadership blended politics with culture, proving that ruling well was not only about enforcing obedience but about shaping values. The impact of queens also extended into social reform. Margaret of Scotland, though not as widely known as Eleanor or Isabella, became a model of pious leadership that combined charity with governance. Married to King Malcolm III, she worked to reform the Scottish Church, align it more closely with broader European practices, and improve the education of the clergy. She was also remembered for her devotion to the poor, establishing institutions that provided food and aid. Her actions were not limited to private charity. They became part of the identity of the Scottish monarchy, intertwining piety with kingship. Her canonization after death reflected the deep impression she left, not only as queen but as a leader who redefined the responsibilities of rule. These examples show how queens extended their influence beyond immediate political struggles. They worked to shape institutions, whether legal, cultural, or religious, and those institutions outlasted them. In doing so, they set precedents that challenged the idea that leadership was purely a male domain. They demonstrated that authority could be expressed through reform, education, and patronage just as much as through military conquest. Their contributions remind us that history is not only written on battlefields, but also in classrooms, monasteries, and courts of law. What makes their legacies resonate even today is the way they embodied a unique blend of authority, resilience, and shrewdness. Queens rarely had the luxury of absolute power. Their authority was contested, conditional, or constrained by law, custom, and expectation. To succeed, they had to be resilient, weathering opposition and adapting to new circumstances. They had to be shrewd, knowing when to press forward, when to compromise, and when to cloak their ambitions in humility. These traits made them adept at navigating complexity, a skill as valuable in today's global politics and corporate leadership as it was in medieval courts. Blanche of Castile, for example, exemplifies the power of resilience. Faced with rebellion and foreign invasion during her regency, she held firm, refusing to be intimidated by nobles who underestimated her. Her ability to project calm authority reassured her supporters and unsettled her enemies. She understood that leadership was not about appearing invulnerable, but about demonstrating the ability to endure. This lesson is timeless. In modern leadership, whether in government or business, the ability to withstand pressure, recover from setbacks, and maintain direction in the face of adversity is as critical as it was in the 13th century. Catherine de' Medici provides another lesson, this time in shrewdness. She operated in one of the most dangerous political climates imaginable, surrounded by factions ready to use religion as a weapon and eager to undermine her regency. Catherine survived because she mastered the art of balance. She shifted alliances when necessary, used marriage as a diplomatic tool, and knew how to manipulate symbols of power to her advantage. Though her reputation remains contested, her ability to keep the French monarchy intact during decades of turmoil is undeniable. Her leadership shows that adaptability and strategic compromise are not signs of weakness, but forms of strength. In a world where leaders must constantly adjust to shifting conditions, Catherine's example remains relevant. Even the cultural legacies of queens carry lessons for modern leadership. Eleanor's patronage of poets and thinkers reminds us that leadership is not only about managing crises, but also about inspiring imagination. A society that believes in ideals will follow its rulers with greater loyalty. In the same way, today's leaders who invest in education, the arts, and cultural identity are shaping not only present stability, but also the future vision of their nations or institutions. To view queens only as women who overcame obstacles is to miss the larger point. Their leadership offers enduring lessons precisely because it transcends gender. Authority, resilience, and shrewdness are qualities that remain central to effective leadership in any era. Their ability to navigate uncertainty, to blend firmness with adaptability, and to leave behind lasting reforms demonstrates a vision of leadership that is as relevant now as it was then. The myths that once confined queens to the margins of history are breaking down. As we open the archives and listen to their voices, we see not anomalies but leaders who stood at the center of power. Their stories remind us that leadership is not defined by who is expected to rule, but by who actually shapes events, institutions, and cultures. From Isabella's reforms to Eleanor's cultural patronage, from Margaret's social initiatives to Blanche's resilience, and from Catherine's strategic cunning to countless others who remain less known, the legacy of queens is one. Even today, in boardrooms, parliaments, and international negotiations, the echoes of their leadership can be felt. The challenges may have changed, but the essence of leadership, balancing authority with adaptability, blending vision with practicality, and securing stability while preparing for the future, remains the same. These queens, far from being silent figures behind kings, stand as some of the clearest examples of how to lead in times of uncertainty. They redefined what it meant to wield power, and in doing so, they left lessons that extend far beyond the medieval crown. The more carefully we look at the stories of medieval queens, the harder it becomes to deny their significance. Their influence was not confined to the turbulent centuries in which they lived. It stretched forward across generations, shaping laws, traditions, dynasties, and even the cultural ideals that continue to define the modern world. While many of their names have been pushed to the margins of history, their decisions created ripples that still move through the political and cultural landscapes of today. Their enduring influence is a reminder that the past is never as simple as it seems, and that leadership, once exercised with vision and determination, can echo far beyond its original moment. When Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon completed the Reconquista, their actions did more than end centuries of conflict on the Iberian Peninsula. They also created the foundations of the Spanish state as a unified power. The marriage diplomacy Isabella orchestrated tied Spain to the Habsburgs, shaping European politics for centuries. Her sponsorship of Columbus's voyage initiated a wave of exploration that permanently altered the global order. These are not footnotes in history, they are turning points. And while Ferdinand has often received credit, Isabella's role was equally decisive. The structures of law, education, and religious conformity that she left behind shaped Spain well into the modern age. Eleanor of Aquitaine's cultural patronage may seem less concrete, but the ideals she helped foster, of chivalry, loyalty, and refined conduct, permeated Europe for centuries. The concept of courtly love, which inspired literature, poetry, and art, influenced not only medieval aristocrats but also the Renaissance and beyond. Her role in dynastic politics also shaped the long struggle between England and France, a conflict that would define the very idea of European nationhood. The Plantagenet dynasty, which she helped to establish, dominated English politics for generations. When we talk about English identity, law, and monarchy, we are in many ways speaking of a legacy Eleanor helped set in motion. The ripples of Margaret of Scotland's work can be traced in the religious and cultural reforms of her kingdom. By bringing Scotland closer in practice to European Christianity, she helped integrate it into the broader cultural and political networks of the continent. Her emphasis on charity and education shaped the Scottish monarchy's identity as a moral as well as political institution. Though she may not have commanded armies or conquered lands, her influence redefined the nature of queenship in Scotland, showing that power could be exercised through reform as much as through conquest. Blanche of Castile's regency ensured the survival of the French crown at a moment when it could easily have fractured. Her Her determination allowed her son Louis to ascend a stable throne and later to become a sainted king whose reign became a model for Christian rulership. Without Blanche's guiding hand, Louis's legacy might never have been possible. In this sense, her enduring influence is woven into the very idea of France as a centralized monarchy. The French crown she safeguarded would later become one of the most powerful institutions in Europe. Even Catherine de' Medici, so often vilified, left a legacy that forces us to reconsider the boundaries of leadership. Her ability to hold the monarchy together during decades of civil war kept the Valois dynasty alive long enough for the Bourbon dynasty to rise. Her patronage of architecture and the arts enriched French culture, leaving visible marks that remain to this day. Her political maneuvers, while controversial, demonstrate the necessity of adaptability in leadership. The France that emerged after her regency bore her imprint, even if later chroniclers were reluctant to admit it. The enduring influence of these queens is not only political or cultural, it is also symbolic. They stand as proof that leadership is not restricted to one gender, that the qualities required to govern, resilience, intelligence, foresight, adaptability, are human traits, not male ones. Their legacies push us to reevaluate the assumptions we have inherited about medieval power. The traditional narrative, centered almost exclusively on kings and male nobles, leaves out half of the story. By overlooking queens, we not only do them an injustice, but also impoverish our understanding of history itself. It is time to shift the narrative. These women deserve recognition not only as supporting figures, but as central actors. Their decisions shaped borders, laws, dynasties, and cultures. Their leadership created stability in times of crisis and laid foundations for future growth. They were not anomalies who slipped accidentally into power. They were leaders who proved that power could be wielded effectively by those willing to embrace its responsibilities, regardless of gender. To relegate them to the margins is to misunderstand the very nature of medieval politics. Reevaluating their role also has broader implications. If queens have been overlooked despite their visible impact, how many other figures in history remain hidden in the shadows? How many stories have gone untold because they did not fit the traditional molds of power and authority? The queens we have explored, Eleanor, Isabella, Blanche, Margaret, Catherine, Urraca, and many others, invite us to look again at the archive, to question who is absent, whose voices have been silenced, and what legacies we may yet uncover. Their enduring influence reminds us that history is not fixed, but constantly evolving as new questions are asked and new perspectives brought forward. To honor these queens is not only to give them the credit they deserve, but also to broaden our vision of the past. In doing so, we can better understand the present, for the lessons of their leadership, adaptability, resilience, cultural patronage, reform, and strategic vision remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Whether in politics, diplomacy, or corporate life, the ability to navigate complexity, to balance firmness with flexibility, and to leave behind enduring structures of stability is still the hallmark of great leadership. The story of medieval queens does not end with their deaths. It continues in the institutions they built, the cultural ideals they fostered, and the lessons they left behind. Their influence lives on in the very shape of modern Europe and in the way we think about leadership itself. And beyond their stories lies a larger challenge: to uncover the many other forgotten figures who remain in the shadows of history. Each of them, like these queens, may carry lessons and legacies waiting to be appreciated. The past is a vast archive of voices, many silenced, many overlooked. By reopening it with fresh eyes, we can not only correct injustices, but also enrich our collective understanding. The queens who once stood beside, or even above kings, remind us that power is never as simple as it seems, and that leadership can take many forms. Their enduring influence invites us to keep searching, to keep questioning, and to keep telling the stories that history has too long neglected.